Hello, this is Alum back for a video, this time a focus video specifically on the Mirandus lore items which were included in Milestone 12. For those wondering, I will be doing a full comprehensive review of Milestone 12, however that will come a little bit later as I wanted to get this information out first, as a lot of people I know were out treasure hunting and looking forward to this. Just as a basic introduction here, there's two different sets of lore items. There's lore items that you loot from mobs, all of which are within Skywound Mine, and that includes the Goblin Archers, Spearmen, Scavengers, and the Brutes drop two of them. There are also two items in Narrow's Landing outside of the Skywound Mine dungeon, and the remaining lore items are on the ground within Skywound Mine, and this video will go through in detail a very efficient route to get all lore items and details with regards to where they are, and I'll finish out at the very end with a full map of all the lore items, including their in-game coordinates. So this first video here shows the new tab in the inventory, and at the present this character does not have any lore items. However, you see there's 4 different archived collections. So starting here, we're starting at outpost number 1 in Narrow's Landing, and we're going to go to the first Narrow's Landing lore item, which is called the Sound of Water. So here we are, starting off in the front of outpost number 1 and leaving through the west exit. We follow along the path. And we just keep following the path. This is the same as the video that I made on how to get to Skywound Mine up to this point. However, once we start going towards there, you're going to see some changes. First off, you see I don't make the first right there. I pass this pile of mountains and go through this little narrow valley. There was a new alpha buck there, which they've changed the appearance on. Looks pretty good. It looks like someone might have got the lore item right there, a halfling. And it's kind of a little in an inconspicuous location right along the shore here. And there we go, the Sound of Water. And now I'm just putting in the coordinates, which you put / and where am I. The next is going towards the Green Goblin Camp, specifically to the Burned Village, and we're leaving from the Rocky Highlands. And these names are new to the areas as they were included in the lore items. So now we actually have real names to locations as opposed to me just making up names and putting them on maps. So continuing on towards the Burned Village. So we're heading north here, and we're about to enter the cave that brings us to the Green Goblin Camp. Now there are 2 different ways to go into Skywound Mine. Once we go through here, we could make a left to go through the lower entrance. However, this lore item works a little better if we go through the upper entrance, so we're going to go there first. And it also makes the video flow smoother as well. And in the introduction, all of the lore items listed, those are consistent with the order that I find them in this particular video. Now, something of interest here is that we see the alpha buck looks like he's potentially guarding the lore item. And I don't have the right armor, so he hits me for quite a lot of damage. But I do manage to get the lucky charm item, and like every other time, I do check the coordinates and record that for help with making my map. Now, the last section of Narrow's Landing is to get out of Narrow's Landing and actually go to the Skywound Mine itself. So we go from our current location in the Burned Village, and we head up to the upper entrance of Skywound Mine. So we're leaving the Burned Village now, and we continue on this mystical adventure with myself, Alum, on a journey of discovery to the lore of Mirandus. Very exciting stuff here. So we go through these switchbacks up the side of the mountain, up towards the upper entrance, which is kind of like a mine shaft. And this is very close to an area where a lot of people typically used to cheese the brute, the green brute there. Now we're going to go from the Skywound mine upper entrance, which we just entered, and we're going to go to our first lore item called Discovery Log MTRM Core Sample. Of note, you should be wearing a full set of tough leather armor for this. There are some brutes that it would be better to wear bronze brigandine armor for, but they can more or less be avoided for the most part. The goblin spearmen do absolutely massive damage if you don't have tough leather armor on, so for this video I'm wearing tough leather armor the entire trek. Okay, so here we are at the upper entrance to Skywound Mine. And wherever possible, I kind of take the off-the-beaten track course in a lot of cases, simply because there tends to be less mobs. Now luckily in both the upper and lower entrance, there's no mobs right at the entrance. So if you are kind of putting together a raid or whatever, you can group up there without any concerns that you're going to be killed by mobs. And here's our first lore item. Discovery Core, MTRM Core Sample, and checking my coordinates. There we go. The next lore item, Calamites Log, is almost directly north here, so we'll get started through there. Now we find our first mobs. The archers and scavengers aren't too much of an issue. With tough leather armor on, the spearmen do about 10 damage. With full bronze brigandine armor on, the brutes do the same damage as well. However, now there are 3 different brutes. One of each color, and they're weaker to the type of damage that they're normally weak to. So the brown or red is weak to crush. These yellow brutes here are weak to pierce. The green brutes are weaker to slash damage. Against the goblins, the goblin spearmen specifically, they now have much higher resistance, so using a weapon that's not advantageous against them, it requires many more hits. We're talking 40 to 50 hits with a sword to kill, say, a brown goblin spearman, as opposed to, say, the Brute's Club, which takes about 8 to 10 hits. Now we're coming up on our first item here, and there it is, Calamites Log in that little mineshaft area. Now we're going to the treasure stash, and interestingly enough, some of us logged out characters at either the treasure stash or near where the boss location is, expecting that to be a significant area, and this was actually the very first lore item that we happened to find, despite being fairly deep within the Skywound mines. Now this whole area has a lot of brutes, although for the most part you can avoid them pretty easily. There's a few parts where it gets a little bit tricky, but you just gotta keep your eyes peeled and be quick on the bandages if you need to. So this is entering into the boss's main chamber area, and we're turning left, which is north, towards the treasure area, and there's a brute or 2 down here, and a bunch of yellow goblins. Nothing to be terribly concerned about. Those spearmen, if you're not wearing the right armor and they get a jump on you, can kill you very quickly. So here we go. This is Hope Was Never With Us. So we found that, which is part of the treasure stash. The next location is within the boss's room, also known as the main altar, and it's called The Mine Took More Than Stone. So we have to backtrack out of the treasure stash area, all the way back up to the main boss's chamber here, and just avoiding all the mobs like we were previously. Pretty simple here, as long as you're sprinting the entire time, have the right armor on, and are paying attention to where you're going, there's not too much of an issue. So that's the new boss's room. You can see it looks like a big minotaur up there. I'm just coming around here, and here we go. The mine took more than stone, which is up in the cage there, and I set the coordinates, which is good. The next location is Mine Whispers, which is in what they call the high entrance, which is kind of interesting because the entrance to Skywound Mine that's at the highest elevation is called the upper entrance, but this particular connector mine shaft is called the high entrance instead. So there's a lot of backtracking through here. Have a good look at the boss there. Yeah, nice little boss room. I can see this is going to be quite the raid encounter. Through this area, sometimes you got to be fighting like 10 brutes at a time, and those mobs, like I said, do quite a bit of damage. It'll be quite nice in terms of a raid encounter for certain. Now we're going into, this area is also called now the main goblin camp. It's a fairly large area. And it's just a typical goblin camp. They do have all the different color brutes in it for the most part. The brownish red brutes. Oh, and there's also this interesting like invisible wall here in this little mine shaft. I'm guessing it's from the props that are hanging down, like those roots, but I think it's a little excessive, the amount of collision that they're causing at this particular time. So I'm again taking kind of the off the beaten path track simply to try to avoid as many brutes as possible and as many mobs in general as possible. And we're going back through the mine shaft here. And these railroad tracks are a real nuisance. You get stuck on them constantly, so you gotta be careful, especially if you're trying to kite things around. And you don't want to kite a whole lot in this particular zone because they've really shortened the leash distance on mobs. You almost have to fight mobs where they are. If you move them any more than like 50 meters in a certain direction, they tend to leash on you. And they leash immediately to full health, which is a real nuisance. Like these three brutes that were crossing through there with a small group of us took us quite a while because we didn't know about the leashing mechanic adjustment since we're in Skywound Mine. So we're entering the high entrance area here and going to our lore item within this particular region. And there it is in that little crate called Mine Whispers. Now I got the coordinates set. The next location is all the way to the foreman's cabin, and that's known as Final Entrance. They're here. We're also getting out of the brutes area as well now, so you won't take a whole lot of damage from this point on. From this point on, the most dangerous area is this first little area here, going through a bunch of spearmen. Although it's only really truly dangerous if you're running past, if you get like stuck on something, like stuck on the railroad track, and they kind of group around you and start hitting you really quickly. Other than that, this part is pretty simple, and there's not a whole lot of mobs. For the most part, it's pretty bare. I don't know if it's going to be like this constantly, or they're actually giving you a little bit of room to move around and such, but I don't particularly mind these little short breaks here. Now we're into these here, these little crawling guys. These are goblin scavengers. They're new with this particular patch, and they're relatively weak. They do move quite quickly, though. That's one thing I noticed. So we're going through a mine shaft here in the just to the east of the dead center of the map. And just having a little look up at the sky, enjoying the scenery while we work our way into the foreman's cabin outlook here. And there we go, final entrance, they're here. And of course got to set those coordinates. The next location is in the lower goblin camp, and it's called the First Omen. So we're leaving the foreman's cabin here. And through lots of scavengers. So our lore item is like due ahead, and I actually got stuck in that fire pit the first time and ended up dying, so try to avoid that. And this particular lore item I had some issues with. So first I got kind of stuck on that cage. And then when I did get there, I couldn't click on it properly. And in the process, I ended up actually getting multiple of that particular item. So I don't know if it was lag or it's bugged or what, but it's still glowing like I can kind of pick it up. I even go into my inventory to see what's been going on if I did get it. And I actually did get multiple of the First Omen lore items. The next location is down to the southeast, and I'm sure it's nothing. And this is kind of the first of the parkour type of lore items, and I kind of like this one. These next couple are much better designed than some of the other ones. So we're getting out of the lower goblin camp full of yellow goblins. Going southeast here to the mine shaft, the first one on the northern part of the east side of Skywound mine. And for the most part, these mine shafts are pretty empty. You see some ore in there, there's some tin and there's also some copper and some. The Skywound mine was supposed to have its own mineral and its own armor set, so I'm guessing that those are probably placeholder at the present, and we're starting to get back into some more green goblins here as well. Passing some of the outlooks there, that's one of them. And our lore item is actually up and to the left here. Right up there. So we gotta find a way to get up there. And that's another outlook, and here it is, first of our parkour, and this was found by Abdo early on. The very first lore item in Narrow's Landing was the last one we actually found, and that was found by Havoc. So I was happy we completed that so that we knew we got all the lore items that are currently accessible. And here we go. I'm sure it's nothing, but it is actually something. It's a lore item. The next lore item is the arrival to Skywound, and we're going to be leaving from the lower path, which is where we currently are, to what's called the Stone Bender Trail, and that's kind of all these raised islands that are sticking well out of the ground, kind of these pillars that are coming out of the water. And it's a little tricky. If you're going to actually die in the process of trying to loot a lore item, this is definitely the place that's going to happen. So we take the quick route, we just jump on down there. And there's a couple of ways you can actually go to enter the Stone Bender Trail. There's a north entrance and a south entrance, but we're closer to the north. And it actually works better to take the north one, you'll see here in a second. So we just keep coming around, going through all these kind of raised pillars. Now you can fall down to your death at any of these points if you were to fall off. And we'll be coming up to our lore item, which is in that rib cage, but you can't actually reach it from here. What you have to do is you have to jump over this right on the very edge to reach it. There we go, arrival to Skywound. So you can fall off there to your death quite easily. The next and last of the ground lootable lore items is the initial excavation report, which is at the lower entrance. So we just take a jump across there, and that's why I said it was probably easier to go from the north side here, because when you loot the item you can just jump off and continue south. pretty tight quarters here. Luckily these mobs don't cause knockbacks or anything. Otherwise there'd be some serious issues there. Not taking a whole lot of damage. Like I said, we have full tough leather armor on here. Going down, and this is the southernmost of the eastern mine shafts. And this one as well is fairly empty, short of a little bit of tin there. And a rabbit. Okay, there's a rabbit. I stand corrected. Could be a vicious rabbit, you never know. I actually didn't kill any of the rabbits to see if they drop a lore item. Maybe that's the secret lore item. They're all full of rabbits. So we're coming into the little entrance area here. And we're going to loot the initial excavation report. And we'll put in our final coordinates. The last section is a quick jot just to get to the other exit of Skywound Mine so that we can exit, completing the full loop to acquire all of the ground accessible lore items. So we're actually pretty close to the entrance here, and that's just a look up. That's where we came from, all the way up there. And that big sign there is to Narrows Landing. So we're going to use all these items that we got so far. These are the lore items. They actually go into your inventory as consumable items before you can read them in your lore archive. Now you'll probably notice that I have two first omens, so I tried to use the second one, but it says could not consume, so that's good to know. So you could just delete that if you so desire. And here's the lore archive now with a bunch of logs filled in. We are missing the ones from the mobs that drop. However, we will take care of that in the very near future. And when you do read the items, you see the check marks turn green, showing that you've completed that particular task. You have to actually exit and go back in when you switch to a different collection as well. But you can go through the entire collection, but just hitting the arrows, which is a nice touch. Now here we're starting with all the looted items. So Shrine Zone Clearance Central Cavern drops from the Goblin Archer, as you can see there. And that gets used. The next one is Something About the Eye from the Goblin Spearman, which you get there. It doesn't look like we looted it, but when we check the inventory we did indeed get it, so we use that. And the last one is Town is Changing from the Goblin Scavenger. And yes, Town changed into Gala and now is essentially turned into dirt. Literally. Following all the initial lore items, we did a 7-hour Skywound Mine Brute raid, and we got all the remaining items. So the ancient symbols I loot from this Goblin Brute. It's about maybe a 1 in 10 chance of dropping. And I used the item there. And the second one is the final expedition log, which I wasn't able to loot. However, it is a little bit rarer than the ancient symbols. So here is our full collection. The only ones we're missing are the drops from the brutes, and I don't know how rare they are, but you can see the items and where they drop from in the notes here. Specifically this question, once you kill a brute, it will list that item as dropping from the brute. So we do know for sure that they do drop from the brutes. I'm just not sure on what the drop rate is. It could be consistent with the other ones, which is along the lines of kind of 20 to 30 mobs, or it could be insane like the Brutes Club and require thousands. I don't know. And that item as well drops from there. Now these last four, they're not currently in game to the best that we know. This last slide shows all of the different locations, and all of them are based on the name of the actual item. So this is interesting. Kuro, which is a Mirandus dev, did mention that not all are in the game and there's some more secret areas going to be included, and that there will be more lore items in the future, and acquiring various lore items will give you a reward of some sort. We don't know the details as of yet. Also, the lore items are not account bound. Every different character you go on, you will require to get all the lore items, assuming you want to acquire all the lore items. So it'll be interesting where they go with this, but this was quite a nice little addition. I had quite a bit of help from multiple different guildmates, namely Havoc, Abdo, Gulliver, Pixel. We all worked together to acquire these and also do some testing with their various mobs. I will, as I mentioned, be making a final review video of this large update. And hopefully by that time I've acquired the brute drops as well, and I'll add that in as a quick note with a link specifically to this video. And I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Thank you and goodbye.